Yes, so narrowing the gap, but after Jimmy's presentation, I feel like I'm just talking about myself being Bob because designers tend to be the bottleneck. But a little bit more about me. My name is Connor Sunis. I'm a UX UI design consultant now, but I've worked in tech for nearly 10 years as a product designer, UX UI designer, UX UI manager, from video games to streaming, transport, health, a lot of different things. But I mainly work with developers because they get stuff done and I don't like talking to leadership too much. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about, how I've managed to do it. But this kind of is a reference to one of my favorite cartoons. It seems like most people in a developer team coexist nicely, and then designers come in and kind of screw it up because we're here trying to be like fluffy and emotional, and then developers just want to know, what do I have to do? This is the problem that designers mostly have. We design for designers and product managers and not really for implementation. So we use a lot of nice language and use justifications of why, but developers don't always want to hear that. They just want to know, what am I building? So we design mostly on the happy flow, which is the word we use for if everything goes nicely, this is how it works, which mostly never happens. And as a UX UI designer, I'm there to preempt what can go wrong, how do we make sure we have the good edge cases, error cases, which means most of the time I lost my hair stressing. But that's kind of what I want to work more with the programmers, to kind of get down, like how do we work together? What do you envision going wrong? How does the tech frameworks work? And then we kind of collaborate and make something together because we're a team. But mostly designers and people that work in product have the future iterations and the knowledge of where the product is going in our heads, but we never share that with the tech, so they can't make good tech decisions. And that's always the case where we run into always having to rebuild everything constantly, or where we're going to go in 2 years. And that's something that we kind of have to be a little bit better at actually doing. And that usually leads to a mentality of designers and programmers versus us versus them. So, we're all about like why it's made, how it's used, and then the development teams are actually doing like how it works and how it's made. But there is a common language, which is how it's used and how it works. That's the only alignment that we seem to have as designers to kind of, we make use cases or user flows, and then you're going to implement certain ways of behavior. This is kind of commonality, and this is something that I've seen that as if we shift as designers to how we actually give our handovers, or what I'm going to talk about later, more of collaboration, it minimizes the time, minimizes the thing that we have to rebuild. So, how do we align? That's the big question between designers and developers. Now, probably good to give a preface. My bachelor was in robotics and software engineering, so I come from a development background, so most of my design stuff that I do has that kind of way of working. It's all about systems, reusability, scalability, but most designers come from a graphic background. So you have to give the language and the tools to design those type of designers to kind of help you work because in the end, we are a team. And we need to speak the same language. So how do we prevent assumptions and clarify our intentions? Because most of the time when you see a design document, you're going to interpret it your way. And that's usually where the issues start to arise. So these are the toolkits that I know once we started in 2 of my companies that I worked on, we've spent some time actually making a common toolkit for all our projects. When I worked at Resolution Games, we were making AR, VR games, and I worked on 12 games at once. So a lot of the time it was reusing different teams' functionality to make the same thing. So we started looking at commonality between the UX UI process of making sure that we had scalable components. So if we have a button for one game, it's the same button for every game and should behave a certain way. And you'd be surprised how many times a button can change between projects. Some people even fought me, why does a button need to be disabled in certain cases? And I was like, this is the most common basic component. But we had a component library that we started to make. So we, no matter what art we put in, it worked the same way in all our projects. We shaved 2 months in every project starting up just by getting a common framework. But it took us 6 months to build. So over time, if you tell a manager about cost return of investment, they're like, that's all about money and time. So when you can say, oh, we can save 2 months, they're really like, oh, okay, we're going to do this. So it's great. And we use a lot more constants. So obviously, if you're working on web, you can do like nice definitions, but in games, it's a little bit trickier. But our colors, our textiles, we just set a set library of like, here's 8 values we're always going to use for this game. So we didn't have color picking because we looked at our UI for one of the text products I used on, and we had 48 colors of red because they just color picked each time. So we just made a common language. And this is what sometimes we give you as designers, these UX flows, which are great to show a complexity of a system, but they're usually very hard to read, and if anyone has a question, you are searching so hard to find the answer. But the only thing that they're really useful for UX designers is to see like where the system can branch out into different features. But if you're developing a part of a system, that's going to be a very hard thing to use. And if you get a question from someone like, but how do I make an account? in an entire system. Q, JSON born, searching, trying to find the thing, and it's awful. So while we shifted, our design documentation was use case breakdowns. So we only delivered set use cases rather than the entire system. And all our error and edge cases were related to a single use case. So when we decided, like, oh, for tasks or stories, user stories you want to use, these tangible little pieces are much easier to break in and to describe. But when we started looking at the actual things that could go wrong, we could then see, well, there's commonality between our error cases. Or this is how we make functional components like we reused. Or we can make new pop-ups. And that's kind of what we did. And we saved, once again, so much time developers. I think we shaved 3 hours of meetings a week just from having one use case breakdown. We can just send the link, explore the FigJam, ask questions. And I didn't have to do the bottleneck of speaking hour upon hour upon hour of just trying to figure out where, one, my document was, and two, this is not what Elvis said, but I just needed someone to contribute this quote to. We delivered basically the use cases and a prototype, because when we, as designers, we give you use states, it's always state by state by state by state, but you lose the stuff in between. So when we deliver a prototype and the use documents, things can't be assumed or interpreted because you're getting the visual functionality of how this thing should work. And that's the now thing that we ever do at when we're now working at King, but every place I now work at, we deliver always use cases and a prototype to the developers, and we walk through with them to see what do they think, what do they explore. And it just makes it much more easier because you can also then put animations. It means more work for designers like me, but that also saves me more work later. So it's kind of, you need to have the foresight of a project like, okay, your time is money, and I also just want to be left alone most of the time. So it works, it's a self-serving, but also it's good for the collaboration. And then this is the big part about it, is collaboration and listening. So if we have a common tools and common language, how do we actually work together? Because as a designer, I remember learning in college, like, oh, you know, you're actually more of a communicator. You're not really doing much. You're just there to facilitate workshops, facilitate, you know, how things are made. But when you actually listen to your teammates, you realize they don't understand me. I'm speaking a foreign language to them. So this is what we're always kind of taught, and what most companies do. I think in the 7 different companies I worked for, everything was a handover process. So I do my work, I push it off, you do it, ask me questions. That's not a really, really good way. And that is kind of counterproductive to the agile way of working. You know, it's meant to be iterative. It's meant to be, you know, something that you constantly develop. So what we started doing is sitting beside, obviously not always physical because it was the pandemic, but on a Zoom call. And we walked through the use cases ourselves with the developers and designers. And that included front end, back end, any type of design and development that we could think of, because we didn't want to have to do I said, you know, hearsay, she said, he said, kind of thing that was happening, because it's always going to be, once again, that's where the assumptions start to arise. So we don't only review front end, we also talk to back end, because they might have an entire framework or APIs that we don't know. And if you talk to a designer about APIs, they will look at you like, I don't know what that is. That is just, you know, magic from the black box. But it's good to do that. And also, if you have a QA department, we make sure that every use case is mapped out them, because they're going to ultimately be testing it. So the use case documentation I showed you kind of earlier, the breakdowns, was then for implementation and testing. Once again, I'm saving time, and I'm not having to ask as many questions or answer as many questions. And then the review process also. So we sat down with the programmers who implemented to make sure that the intention was correct. So we didn't just kind of wait till it goes live. We're like, okay, good, the data is going. I did my part. We also did review sessions with the entire development team and the designer to see, like, okay, are we anything mapped out? If we reviewed it and did the implementation correctly, great, it worked well. Most of the times, there's always going to be parts that not match our intention. But now we actually had the place where we could see why were things changed in the technical implementation. Because once we know things, most people are like, oh, at least I know, that's fine. But designers don't kind of like, oh, I saw in the product and it's not what I intended, and then they go, you should have like a piss fit up to the management, like, this is not what we wanted. And we don't want to do that. We're a team. That's the main thing. So this is kind of what most teams are structured. It's a silo, and that is such an counterproductive to the agile method. We should not just get hand over, or you do your part, I did mine. That is not how it should be. We have to bring down the silo. That's the main thing. And I'm an anarchist at heart, so I'm always like, let's break down the system. And that's all we can do by just working together, having a common language, and, you know, working together with the developers. And designer, that's the part where you get to learn more. And if you're not learning, you're not really growing as a person. So that's what I always think is the most interesting. Thank you. 26 seconds left. Bye.